Morning, Mayor Watson.
Morning.
My name is Brendan Miller. I'm counsel for
Afternoon.
Freedom Corp, which is a organization that represents the protesters that were in your city in January and February 2022. Just going to get set up here. So, Mayor Watson, following up on some of my friends' questions that have been put to you today and how things have come out, can you agree with me that you did not handle the situation that was before you in January and February of 2022 properly?
No, I think I would characterize it as, given all of the information and the circumstances, we did the best we could, which obviously was not good enough.
Okay. And can you agree with me that you politicalized the protests and politicalized the situation?
No, I disagree with that.
All right. Can you agree that the politicalization of the matter, for which you claim was not yourself, but that the matter was politicalized by the federal government?
No.
You agree that making any of the protests a political issue in the governance level created problems?
No.
All right. Can you agree with me that the following governments and agencies handled this matter properly? First, the government of Ontario.
Ultimately, yes, they did handle it properly, but it took some time to get to that stage.
Okay. And the Ontario Provincial Police.
The same.
And the Ottawa Police Service.
Yeah, they were on the ground from day one, but obviously, as I've expressed, I would have liked to have seen the intervention to bring back our streets to our people done much sooner.
Right. And so you've said that they were on the ground from day one, right?
That's right. They were the jurisdictional police service.
Right. And as the mayor of a town, you don't have or of a city, you don't have the security clearance or the clearance to know what the actual operational activities are of a police agency, correct?
Well, it's not a security clearance matter. It's a matter that there's a separate autonomous organization called the Ottawa Police Services Board that has full jurisdiction over policy and governance of the police board and the hiring and firing of 4 key officers. And that is their responsibility. The only direct link that the city has, as you may know from the Police Services Act, is that we approve or reject the budget of the police board.
Right. So I'm going to take you back. So I'll just be more narrow. So during the protests, you did not know what the operational activities were of the Ontario Provincial Police, correct?
I wouldn't know what their operational activities were, but they were coming under the jurisdiction and responsibility of the Ottawa Police Service. But again, I was never made aware of the operational plan, nor was I given the specific time that it was going to be launched, because it would be outside my jurisdiction. You could put 2 and 2 together and you started to see more police arrive. You knew it was happening imminently, but I didn't have the specific date, nor should I.
Right. And so you saw certain uniformed officers arrive, right? From the Ontario Provincial Police.
Well, I don't know if all of them were in their uniform. There were lots that were plainclothes, I suppose, but I saw a lot of OPP officers in Ottawa when we finally got to that 1,800 number, that's for sure.
You didn't know how many officers really the Ontario Provincial Police had here from January 26th until the invocation of the Emergencies Act, did you?
Well, our chief said that on average we had about 50 to 55 police officers from OPP at different stages on a daily basis.
All right.
But nowhere near the 1,500 that the Solicitor General referred to on one day.
And so just in summary, you had, with respect to their operational plans and what they were doing and everything that the police were up to, you did not know what they were doing, either the Ontario Provincial Police or the Ottawa Police Service, right? They didn't tell you because they couldn't.
Well, there's church and state, there's a separation. The Police Services Board is autonomous under provincial legislation, and even the board itself, and I sat on the board for a number of years, but even the board itself does not have the ability to direct the chief on an operational matter. So if they wanted to get together and say, pass a motion, we want you to go and, take care of speeders on Carling Avenue for the next 2 months, that would be ruled out of order. It's not appropriate.
Right. So I just want to make it very clear, and I'd just like you to answer this question, if you don't mind. The Ontario Provincial Police and the Ottawa Police Service did not and could not update you on their actual operational plans, correct?
Not on the operational plans, but obviously we received information in terms of their discussions with other police services in terms of securing those resources in the nation's capital.
Now, you used to be the communication director for the Speaker of the House and Federal Parliament, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you then became a member of provincial parliament?
No, I became a member of City Council.
And then a member of provincial parliament after that?
No, then mayor.
Then mayor, and then a member of provincial parliament after that?
No, then president of Canadian Tourism Commission.
Well, congratulations. But at some juncture, you became a member of provincial parliament, correct?
You got it now.
All right. Thank you very much. And when you became that member of provincial parliament, it was with the Liberal Party of Ontario at the time. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you then became the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing from October 30th, 2007.
Yes.
And you held that office until January 12th, 2010.
Correct.
And the Minister of Municipal Affairs, that's the ministry that oversees the city of Ottawa and all of our municipalities under the Municipalities Act, right?
Well, the minister is responsible for the acts. I'm not the overseer of municipalities, but they are my, I suppose, a client, if you could put it that way, that any municipal issue I was responsible for in cabinet.
Right, but you're very familiar, of course, then, because you held that office with the Municipal Act, correct?
I am, yes.
Right, and you'd also be familiar with that as the mayor of a city.
Yes.
All right. And the current Minister of Municipal Affairs, and at the time of the protest, was Mr. Steve Clark, correct?
Correct.
And the city of Ottawa, like all municipalities across the country, it's a creature of statute that exists at the behest of the provincial legislature. Is that correct?
Yes, constitutionally.
Yes, and you agree that if Provincial Parliament of Ontario wanted to, they could set out how they want Ottawa to be governed and can basically do what they wish in that regard, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah. And you can agree with me that the city of Ottawa is treated the same by the government of Ontario as any other municipality in Ontario, aren't they?
It depends on the issue. There are some times where we feel that we're underserved in terms of provincial grants and contributions, and other times we feel we're treated fairly.
Okay. I've not seen in any of the many records in this proceedings that have been produced that at any time whatsoever that you contacted Minister Clark.
I don't know if I had a call with Steve or not. I certainly had discussions with his colleague, Minister McLeod, on a number of occasions, and she was very helpful in relaying information. But really, the matter we were dealing with fell completely outside the jurisdiction of the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. It was very much the Solicitor General who was the lead minister, and that was amplified by the fact that the Premier brought her on the calls.
Okay, so the issue that you were facing was a resource issue, was it not?
Resource of people, yes, police officers.
Right. And as the former Minister of Municipal Affairs, you know then that under Section 302 of the Municipal Act, that the minister may, upon such terms and conditions as it considers available or advisable, make grants and loans and provide other financial assistance to a municipality, right? You're aware of that?
Yes.
And at no time did you ever ask for any form of financial assistance from Minister Clark, did you?
No, I did with the Premier.
You did with the Premier?
Yeah.
Right, but you and I both know from your former workings as the actual minister that you go through the minister's office, right? You ask them for financial assistance and they can give you a grant and give you money to deal with things like protests on an emergency basis, even if they want, right?
No, there has to be a program in place. You just don't go up to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and ask for a grant. We indicated to the Premier very clearly, as I did with the Prime Minister and his ministers, that we are counting on those two orders of government when this is all said and done and finished, that we would be keeping very close tabs of all of the extraordinary costs that we incurred in order to bring peace to our city. And both the Prime Minister and the Premier said that we'll be there for you to help financially. And we have since submitted all of our costs. It's in the tens of millions of dollars because, as you know, particularly when the municipal police services arrive, they have to be put up in hotels. They have to be given 3 meals a day. There's expenses, and we reimburse all of those municipalities. I, for instance, ran into the Mayor of Belleville a few weeks ago here in Ottawa, a few months ago rather, at the AMO conference, and he thanked us for the quick repayment of the invoice that they received. So the Premier was very specific and very generous, as was the Prime Minister, that they would be here to help us financially, because the protesters were coming not to protest the corporation of the City of Ottawa. They're protesting mandates that were imposed by the provincial and federal government. We happen to be the, as I said, the meat and the sandwich. We're caught in this middle fight between protesters and 2 other orders of government that are responsible for various mandates with respect to COVID-19. So, I wouldn't have gone to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing because most of his funding on an emergency basis is through the DRAP program, the Disaster Relief Program. This was not a disaster.
So it wasn't a disaster?
No, it was a crisis.
Okay.
And the disaster is a natural disaster. The bad storm we had a little while ago, the flooding in 2017, 2019, the tornado in 2018, that's where we seek support of the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and also through, again, the Solicitor General when we called the Army in to help with the sandbagging and the flooding in Ottawa.
Right. So the thing is can you agree with me as the former Minister of Municipal Affairs that having a program set out is not a requirement for the minister to give a city a grant? They can actually just do it under the Municipal Act, can they not?
Well, there has to be a program in place. There's not a slush fund that's kept by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing that is there in case a bunch of truckers come and take over a city. There's no such program. You can't,
Well, I understand that, but what I'm saying to you is this, is that the minister, and when you were minister, you had the power to grant these grants even if there was no program. Is that not true?
No, that's not true.
Okay.
And secondly, I'm not sure why we would be going to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing for a grant. All we were asking for was the compensation to make us whole, to ensure that we received after the whole situation had been resolved, to make sure that we had the necessary receipts. And our treasurer is very good at this, along with the CFO of the Ottawa Police. All of the costs were incurred. I think the figure was, and I stand to be corrected, well over $36 million in costs. So that is being worked on now.
The City of Ottawa then had adequate financial funds to deal with the protest?
Yes, we did. We have healthy reserve funds.
So the only issue was actually getting bodies, right?
Well, getting bodies, yes, but also having the Emergencies Act so that we could get tow trucks and we could have a plan in place that once the police moved in, we could actually move those trucks that refused to move and tow them to a central location.
I just got something you said. You said you wanted the Emergencies Act.
Yeah.
You needed it to get the tow trucks.
Well, we needed something to get the tow trucks because we're not successful. So when the Emergencies Act was introduced, and it was made clear specifically one line that towing was one of the requirements that people could not say no to, that was a big win for us in the City of Ottawa.
And I take it, Mr. Mayor, that you have, of course, a relationship with probably numerous members of Parliament from your position as mayor in Ottawa, right?
Correct, yes.
Did anybody tell you before the Emergencies Act was invoked that it was coming?
No.
All right. So you didn't know if you were going to get these powers or what have you were going to be ordered with respect to towing vehicles?
No, when the act was introduced and my staff basically printed off a copy of the act and highlighted those sections that we could use. The one that caught my attention the first was the towing capacity to clean up the situation in Centertown and Bynum Market.
So you do know, and you've already mentioned that, of course, the Ottawa Police Service Board is independent of the police service, the Ottawa Police Service, and they have no ability to order operational sort of orders or bylaws, right?
Yes, they don't pass bylaws, but
And as the former Minister of Municipal Affairs, you also know that, of course, the province of Ontario and the Premier and the ministers at the provincial level, they have no ability to order the OPP to do anything with respect to resources either.
that's correct.
Right. So you know these two things, right? And you knew them at the time,
Yes,
right? And it would have been the commissioner of the OPP that would be making those decisions, right?
yes, he was in contact with Chief Slowly.
Right. And at no time, and that's Mr. Thomas Carrerick, is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. And you agree with me that at no time while you were looking for these resources, did you contact the commissioner of the OPP to outline what you wanted, right?
No, that would be inappropriate
That would be inappropriate.
to contact an OPP officer.
He's the commissioner of the OPP. What's the difference? You're okay with having contact with the prime minister of the country, but you're not okay having contact with the commissioner of the OPP to ask him for what you need.
Because we have a system in place where we do not have politicians interacting directly with police officers or superintendents or commissioners. That would be highly inappropriate. That's why, as a politician, my counterpart is not the OPP commissioner, it's the Premier and the minister responsible for the Solicitor General. So it would be highly inappropriate. During this whole period, I did not once speak to the commissioner of the OPP or the commissioner of the RCMP. Completely inappropriate. So, I dealt at the political level with members of parliament, members of provincial parliament, ministers, and the Premier and the Prime Minister. That was my role in this period in our city's history.
Okay. And did you have phone calls with the Minister of Justice and the Premier with respect to what you needed?
Well, we had discussions with the Solicitor General and the Premier. And at the federal level, it was the Minister of Emergency Preparedness and Public Safety and the Prime Minister.
Right. And so again, just in your statement that you provided, I didn't see when the dates were that you had these conversations with the Premier. When were they? What were the dates?
Well, I'll have to look them up. I don't recall what they are, but I believe it was in, it was 2 or 3 during the month of, I believe, February.
February. So
I stand to be corrected, but I don't know the specific dates. The Prime Minister's office did provide a quasi transcript, so we have the specifics on that. But these calls that I had with the Premier were, one of them was basically he called me on my cell phone. We had a long discussion about the situation that was on the ground. And then the other was when the Minister of the Solicitor General joined us and we had a discussion about the need for OPP officers.
okay. So, and I can tell you that the Prime Minister and the Premier were talking around that time too. And the Premier had told the Prime Minister, and I'm going to put it to you that he also told you, that he had no ability to order the OPP to provide you officers. It had to come from the Commissioner and the OPP themselves, right?
Right.
Right. And he told you that.
I don't know if he told me that, but the Solicitor General sent a letter, as we saw earlier today, indicating that she had sent our request, the letter that Councillor Deans and I sent to the Premier and the Solicitor General. She had sent that to the Commissioner of the OPP, which is the proper route, not telling him what to do, indicating that this request has come in and to please take the appropriate action.
Right. And the Premier told you that he wouldn't join the tripartite meetings because it was pointless.
He felt it was a waste of time.
Right. And it was.
How do you know that?
Because you were looking for officers and they couldn't order officers.
No, that's, I don't think you fully understand the situation that I can't pick up the phone and start barking orders at a commissioner of any police service, whether it's the OPP or the RCMP. There's a protocol in place, and that protocol is to have a politician to politician. And the RCMP and the minister said the same thing. He can't direct Commissioner Leckie, but he can certainly pass along our request. And she made the decision, and we thank her and the commissioner because at the end of the day, they did provide the resources that ended up cleaning up this terrible situation our residents found themselves in.
Right. And this protocol that you've been talking about and mentioned, is it in writing?
Well, it's the law that politicians are not allowed to direct police services. It's very,
I understand that, but there's nothing that I know of, at least, and if you could point me to it, that says that you were prevented from either calling Commissioner Lucky or calling the commissioner of the OPP and saying, hey, we need some more resources. Can you do this?
Again, I think that would be entirely inappropriate, to give the powers of operational responsibilities to politicians is a
I'm
very
not saying that,
slippery
sir.
slope.
I'm asking you if there's an actual policy that says you are not allowed to call and make a request to the police. Is there a policy in that regard?
Well, our city solicitor advised that the route that we should be taking is the letter to the premier and the prime minister and the two appropriate
Okay, so it wasn't a
ministers.
protocol. It was what the city solicitor told you to do.
Well, I'm assuming that he would have told me what to do based on the law of the land. And
Okay.
the
Well,
policy is very,
I'll ask
very
him
clear.
about that when he testifies.
Sure.
The other questions I have for you have to do with the mediator. Now, you had asked
With what?
the mediator. You had asked the federal government if they could appoint an independent mediator. Is that right?
Yes,
And the federal government said no.
that's correct.
Right. And they said no because they didn't want to look like they were engaging with the protesters. Is that right?
You'd have to ask them. I can't speculate why, although, as you know, there was a movement on the same day by two colleagues on council to bring a resolution to council to ask the federal government to allow a mediator to try to find a middle ground. That motion never made its way onto the council agenda, so
Right.
council didn't take a position.
You said that you had no issues with financial resources at the time. So why didn't you just hire a mediator?
Well, again, the issue that the protesters were in Ottawa was not to protest the city of Ottawa, but federal and provincial mask mandates, among other issues that the truckers were upset with. So it was not really up to the city to start that kind of a broad-based mediation. What we did do, and what we were somewhat successful, was to secure an agreement by Ms. Leach and those truckers who fell under her jurisdiction, for lack of a better term. And I believe that was successful. We were able to get 40 big rigs and about 60 smaller ones out of the residential area and onto Wellington Street.
Right.
So that was not mediation. That was an individual, Mr. French, who came forward and offered at no charge the ability to see if there was some common ground between our police service and the protesters. But in terms of why the federal government didn't want to deal with a mediator, you'd have to ask them.
So Mr. French steps forward. He says, I can help. And he finds some common ground and was going back and forth, of course, between the city and the protesters.
Yes.
So he mediated the issue.
Well, he was a facilitator because he ended up getting a letter from me and then a subsequent response from Ms. Leach. And the activities took place, I think, the next day, and then they were halted once the Emergencies Act was implemented, I believe, on the 14th.
Right. And after that agreement was done, the protesters followed the agreement and tried to get on to Wellington, and the only thing that ended up stopping them was the police. Is that correct?
No, the police were there actually to help facilitate and traffic manage the congestion to bring them on to Wellington Street and away from the residential areas. So a senior officer was assigned, and my understanding was that it worked quite well. And then the Emergencies Act basically put a halt to that because all resources for police were needed to clear the area the following days.
I put it to you that after the Emergencies Act was invoked, and you may have heard some of this evidence yesterday, that there was just a change and that it was the city who decided not to follow through with the agreement with the protesters. And that was what happened with respect to that agreement.
No, I believe that we did our best to live up to the agreement, and as did the truckers who did move, and we appreciate that because
Right.
that was the first time, as you know, where there'd been any kind of movement on the ground. There was a level of frustration. There was more and more rowdyism that was taking place in the streets of Ottawa. And we felt, as my number one preoccupation was to protect those residents who had been putting up with horn honking 24 hours a day, diesel fumes that were coming into their apartments and condominiums, and general unruliness where people were afraid to leave their homes.
Right. And so you would agree then these statements that have been out by various people that the protesters did not live up to the agreement are incorrect. In fact, they did.
So I'm not sure who you're referring to.
There's been numerous, it's okay, but you agree that the protesters lived up to their end of the bargain, right?
On that particular issue, yes.
Right. And you had earlier said in your evidence that, you couldn't negotiate with these people rationally, but you did have that done in the end, didn't you?
No, I didn't get involved in it because I did not believe that I should be personally involved, but Mr. French acted as a go-between between the city, OPS, and the group under Ms. Leach. And, we're appreciative of Mr. French. He had really no skin in the game. He was not being paid for this. There was no business angle. I think he saw what was happening and
Right.
it was his capital as well.
And sorry, I don't
he
mean to
took
interrupt,
action.
but I just want to get my question answered. So they said, you said earlier you couldn't negotiate with them rationally and you had no dealings with any negotiations with them except for the issue with Mr. French, right?
I had one or two calls with Mr. French, and then it was handed over to Mr. Kanalakis and Mr. Arbat.
Right. And so prior to that time, you had no attempt or nothing of involvement with respect to attempting to negotiate with the protesters, correct?
That's correct.
All right. So your statement earlier that you could not negotiate with these people rationally, you agree that the one time that you actually had any involvement whatsoever, you did, right? You had a rational negotiation that resulted in an agreement, correct?
No, I didn't because I wasn't involved until the final agreement came
I understand.
forward.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. For the record, Brendan Miller, I'm counsel to the Freedom Corp, which is an organization representing the protesters that were in your city in January and February of 2022. So just first off, I want to talk to you sort of in your capacity as being the director of safety and that sort of things, or overseeing that department. Can you agree with me that between January 27th and February 14th, there were over 3,000 tickets issued for provincial and municipal infractions?
That sounds correct. I'd have to actually look at the numbers, but we did provide all of those documents through the disclosure process.
Right. And were some of those tickets issued by the bylaw office?
Most of them were issued by the bylaw office.
Right. And I take it that during the issuing of those over 3,000 tickets, none of your bylaw officers were assaulted?
There were some contentious times, and so I can't say that none of them were assaulted. Not that I know of. Not
to be enough, right? So you never had reported to you and no charges were laid against any protester issued a ticket with respect to physically assaulting a bylaw officer?
No, I just know that a couple of them got swarmed, but that they didn't get physically assaulted.
Okay, so 3,000 tickets is a lot. That's a lot of interactions with a lot of protesters, and not a single assaulting a peace officer charge was laid in relation to your bylaw officers.
That's correct.
Now, the numbers I understand is that between January 27th and February 14th, there were a total of 31 arrests made. Is that correct, of the protesters?
You'd have to ask the police that. I don't capture those numbers.
Okay. You don't keep those sort of numbers? You don't capture those sort of numbers?
I don't manage the police. I manage all other emergency services in the city of Ottawa.
Okay. To your knowledge, is it not true? Again, you don't have to, if you don't have the information, please just advise. To your knowledge, is it not true that only 16 people of the protesters between that same time period, January 27th and February 14th, were charged?
I can't speak to that.
Thank you. Now, dealing with some of the stuff with respect to the cooperation of the leaders of the protest, as well as dealing with the safety lanes and that sort of thing, Is it not true that the protest leaders were actually concerned about maintaining the safety lanes and raised that with you?
They did.
Right. And they wanted to ensure that the lanes were open so that emergency vehicles could always get through?
Correct.
Right. And the protest leaders cooperated with you and the city in maintaining those safety lanes, right?
Yes.
Right. And they maintained them.
For the most part, yes.
Yeah. And when new trucks would even arrive, they even organized to talk with what they refer to as block captains. Did they relay that to you?
No.
All right. But when new vehicles had arrived, to your knowledge, you agree that they always organized to make sure that those safety lanes were open.
Yes.
And you did have, I believe, your fire chief even do an inspection of the Coventry Street or Coventry?
Yep. Just for clarity, the fire chief wouldn't have done the inspection, but one of his chief officers would have. So there are many different chief levels within the fire service.
Right. And when that fire chief did the inspection, he asked them not to have any open, he did not, or he asked them not to have any open fire pits. Isn't that right?
I can't speak to that. I don't
Okay.
know the contents of that.
Right. I understand that you attended a logistics meeting at City Hall on Sunday evening of February 13th to discuss the trucks moves.
Yeah, that's the only time I ever met with the organizers of the protest.
Is it not true that at that meeting, the protesters explained that two removed camps outside of the city had already been established outside of the city where they would go to?
From my recollection, the discussion was around how are we going to move the trucks out of the residential areas, and that there was limited spots on Wellington Street. So I wasn't 100% sure we could move all 400 trucks onto Wellington. Actually, I knew we couldn't move all 400 trucks onto Wellington Street, and that the agreement, from as far as I was concerned, meant that they had to make sure that those other vehicles left town and left the city of Ottawa. And
Okay.
they said yes, that they had secured ground or
and that's
farmers' properties outside of the city.
right. So that's what I'm trying to clarify, because I'm just
Yep.
trying to be fair to you, because there's going to be evidence about that. So
Right.
they told you that they had set up two camps in properties they were allowed to be at outside of the city, and that they were looking to move there.
Yeah, they told me that, but I was also aware of that through other intelligence reports as well.
And then the plan was that other vehicles would go there, and then there would be some other vehicles that would go to Wellington. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. And the city agreed to that.
Yes.
Right. Now, if the protesters were able to move the vehicles on Tuesday and Wednesday, which is February 15th and 16th, as had been agreed, can you agree that the result would have been most, if not all, of the vehicles would have been cleared out of downtown except for Wellington?
I can't agree with that, only because I didn't see a lot of vehicles moved except for the ones we allowed onto Wellington. So there seemed to be some movement onto Wellington, but no movement out of the city as was agreed to. So if there would have been a good faith movement on both parts, then I could maybe agree to that, but I can't today.
Right, but isn't it true, and the commission's heard evidence, that the move onto Wellington eventually got blocked?
It got stopped by police, yes.
Right, so it got stopped by the police, so the deal didn't go through because of the police.
Yes.
Right, and so if the deal went through and it was followed, the only vehicles and trucks of the protesters would have been on Wellington.
I am not confident that would have happened.
Right, but there was no reneging on the deal on behalf of the protesters at the time, and that's the evidence the commission's heard today or to date. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but
Thank you.
But the delta was they didn't control all the people in that block. They said they wanted to control all of them, and they hoped that they would have all of their buy-in, but they didn't. They had difficulty moving the 40 to Wellington Street because people didn't want to move.
Okay, but the difficulty in moving individuals to Wellington Street after the agreement was announced, I put to you, was only stopped because the police wouldn't let them on to Wellington, and because the police then also stopped them from leaving the streets they were parked on. Isn't that correct?
No, I can't speak to that. You'll have to ask Staff Sergeant Drummond about
Thank you.
that.
Those are my questions.
Thank you.
And if you like this video, remember to like and subscribe and press that notification button to receive more information like this. You can also follow me at yellowhead.vote to stay informed and get the inside scoop. Thank you.